Halloween, my second favorite time of the year. The first being the dead of winter when everything is frozen and everyone's miserable because when others are miserable, I'm jolly as a jolly rancher. Anyway, Halloween is a special time of year. It's the only time of year where I'm not looked at as a complete fucking weirdo for watching horror movies all the time. It's not the only time of year where you can see hot women in skanky costumes because that's been ruined by conventions and Instagram, but they're more festive, I guess. Anyway, the point is I love Halloween, and I don't just celebrate it on Halloween. I think my generation has moved past that, and I celebrate it pretty much from the last few days of September all the way until the first or second week of November. And why should it be any different on my YouTube channel? So I'm going to devote all the videos I do from now until the first or second week of November to everything Halloween and horror related. And what better way to start off than by talking about one of my personal favorite Halloween traditions, binge watching the first 12 or so Simpsons Halloween episodes. Quick little rundown of what the Simpsons Halloween Special, or Treehouse of Horror if you're feeling formal, is. The first one aired in the second season in 1990 and became a yearly tradition ever since. They mostly serve to give the writers a little break from the main show so they could, break the rules a bit, go a little crazy. Each episode is broken down into 3 segments, sort of like a short anthology, and most times, especially in the early years, episodes were parodies of old Twilight Zone episodes or 80s and 70s horror movies, with some more modern parodies. But as time went on, the stories started to go for more current movies and TV shows, some of which weren't even Halloween or horror related. And by current, I mean sometimes as long as a year or two out of date due to the production schedule of The Simpsons. Each episode has a different opening, and the openings became more elaborate with each season. The first 4 Treehouse of Horror episodes actually had framing devices and wraparound segments. This was dropped in order to give more time for the actual 3 stories contained in the episodes. Which is ironic that they did that, because now the opening sequences are so elaborate that they can take up to 2 minutes of screen time or more. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you only have 22 to 23 minutes of airtime to put 3 stories into, that is a lot. Oftentimes, that means 1 or 2 of the 3 segments is going to be nerfed down. Also, at first, in the titles, they were referred to as the Simpsons Halloween Special, but starting with the 13th installment, they used the name Treehouse of Horror. And yes, I know all the official production titles were always Treehouse of Horror, but I find it strange that they decided to do this 13 years into the yearly tradition. I have my issues with modern Simpsons in general, and this extends to the Treehouse episodes, but we're not going to talk about that. Today I'm going to break down my top 10 favorite Treehouse of Horror segments, because these are a fucking staple in my Halloween festivities and are very near and dear to me. I don't really have a set criteria for this. I guess you can say I'm basing it on how funny it is, how effective it is at being Halloween or horror based, and my own personal relationship with the segment. I'm not instating a cutoff for these, but don't expect anything past season 10 in here. Also, I can't guarantee it, but I will try to put no more than 2 segments per episode in here. So I've stalled long enough, let's get down to my top 10 favorite Treehouse of Horror segments of all time. Coming in at number 10, we have Bad Dream House, the first ever Treehouse of Horror story to air. Bad Dream House is a parody of several haunted house movies, but draws mostly from Amityville Horror and Poltergeist. Basically, the Simpsons buy a huge house on a bargain, but uh-oh, it's haunted. The house keeps trying to haunt them out of the house, and then later tries to convince them to kill each other. Eventually, Marge lays down an ultimatum that they'll have to get along, and then the house implodes. The first Treehouse of Horror is rocky, much like the early episodes of The Simpsons themselves, but it has some silver lining, such as the part where Homer falls from the ceiling, which is a scene my friend Mike always laughs at, which I mostly attribute to the fact that when The Simpsons aired on Teletoon, the Halloween ads in the 90s and early 2000s showed this scene a lot. Also, the vortex to another dimension bit is just rife for the memeing.
Quit throwing your garbage into our dimension.
Maybe I just like this because it is the start of every binge of Treehouse of Horror I do. Maybe I just appreciate the artistry. Either way, first Treehouse segment to air makes the number 10 spot on my list. Just a note, I honestly was considering putting the Raven in here because its art style is gorgeous, but I think Bad Dream House is all around the stronger segment. On to number 9.
You didn't tell me it was built on an Indian burial ground! No, you didn't! Well, that's not my recollection.
At number 9, we have Starship Poopers, and yeah, this is a later one. This is around when The Simpsons was pivoting from its classic Golden Age era into its Silver Age midlife crisis. Starship Poopers starts off with Maggie teething, and then it turns out she's not just teething, she's transforming into an alien.
Look, Marge! Maggie lost her baby leg!
We learn that in the continuity of this particular episode, Maggie is the result of a crossbreeding experiment between Marge and Kang, Marge having been abducted before her birth. This leads to Kang returning to Earth, wanting to take Maggie back to his homeworld, and Homer understandably being resistant. As a result, they end up on fucking Jerry Springer, which at the time was a huge cultural phenomenon. The chaos that ensues on the Springer show is fucking hysterical. It's the main reason why I put this here. It goes from a fight to Kang disintegrating everybody in the audience with his ray gun to Jerry Springer being fucking murdered on air. Not much to say about this one, but it's just fucking hysterical and is a great time capsule of the era. Every time me and my friend Brad get drunk at an event and make a spectacle of ourselves, you can see one of us posting this image to our socials the next day. I would go as far as to say that Starship Poopers is probably the last classic Treehouse of Horror segment, and I love it on a purely superficial basis. It has little to do with Halloween other than Kang and Kodos appearing, and has even less to do with horror. Nevertheless, it's a pretty hilarious little time capsule of late 90s pop culture.
What the f? Get the baby off, son of a...
Slipping in at number 8, we have Bart Simpson's Dracula. I'm not a huge vampire guy when it comes to my horror. I don't know why there just hasn't been a vampire movie that really blew me away. That being said, I do somewhat enjoy Lost Boys and Coppola's Dracula and Blade, and this segment parodies two of those. Everything about Bart Simpson's Dracula is great. It's funny, it does have some minor spookiness to it, and it's a good little send-up of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula movie that was released the year before. Basically, the family is called to a dinner at Mr. Burns' castle, leading to this legendary shitpost format, and Lisa suspects that Burns is a vampire. This is solidified when she and Bart come across his coffin and the other vampires. Bart gets transformed into a vampire and terrorizes Lisa in this Lost Boys parody, and so the family kills the head vampire, Mr. Burns. But of course, it turns out Mr. Burns isn't the head vampire, it's Marge, and it ends with them all about to attack Lisa before breaking out into a Charlie Brown Christmas parody. This segment is just the perfect finishing touch to a nearly perfect Treehouse of Horror episode. Homer's line,
Yeah, his hairdo looks so queer.
I heard that.
He was a boy!
gets me every time. And the segment pays respect to the source material while spoofing it tastefully. This is actually the first adaptation of Dracula I ever saw, and it's stuck in my memory to the point that I have trouble taking the Coppola movie completely seriously, often quoting the aforementioned hairdo line when Dracula first appears. Nevertheless, this is a legendary Treehouse of Horror segment and deserves to be put on this list.
Come in. Fresh victims for my ever-growing army of the undead.
Sir, you have to let go of the button.
Oh, son of a bitch!
What the fudge? Oh, for Pete's sake! Jiminy Christmas! Ah! Darn it!
Coming in 7th place is the Omega Man. This is another pretty good parody of a classic horror movie they did. Omega Man is based on the movie The Omega Man, which was adapted from the book I Am Legend. But honestly, this one's just wild. Mayor Quimby insults the friend, Springfield gets nuked, Homer was shopping for a bomb shelter so he survived, and he starts fucking around in the apocalyptic Springfield, finds out that the citizens are mutants, but he also finds his family's still alive, and they blow the mutants away. Happy ending. This segment is another one I'm putting on here purely for the accuracy of the source material and the laughs that it provides. As a huge Chris Farley fan, I think the parody they do of his movies is pretty fucking solid, and Homer dancing naked in the church singing that song, War, What Is It Good For? Never gets old. Also, Points for Marge flat out breaking character and killing the mutants. Like, they clearly pulled that conclusion out of nowhere just to end it, but it's great. Also, look how fucked up Mr. Burns looks in that pile. This shit gives me nightmares. Treehouse of Horror 8 is probably the earliest Treehouse of Horror episode I remember seeing when it aired for the first time, and despite being of somewhat less quality than the earlier ones, it still has its fair share of laughs and achieves being a good send-up to the movies that it parodies, specifically the Omega Man. It's a solid entry in what I could say is the last of the truly solid Treehouse of Horror episodes.
Die, you chalk-faced goons!
Coming in at number 6, we have The Bart Zone. Shockingly, this is the first Twilight Zone parody to make it onto my list, and I'm not sure if it's going to be the last because at the time for this writing, I have not set in stone what 5, 4, and 3 are going to be. But anyway, The Bart Zone is a parody of the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, which was also remade in the Twilight Zone movie and had a sequel in the 2002 Twilight Zone reboot. Anyway, it's probably one of, if not the most referenced Twilight Zone episodes of all time. Much like the source, Bart Simpson is depicted here as having omnipotent godlike powers that he uses to terrorize the people of Springfield, and a lot of the humor comes from that. The hilarious antics range from him changing history itself based on his wrong answers on a history test, to him forcibly keeping Krusty the Clown awake so that the Krusty the Clown show can air 24/7. The whole prank call with Moe is a fan favorite, you know, the one where he says,
I'm a stupid moron with an ugly face and a big butt, and my butt smells, and I like to kiss my own butt.
But for me personally, the two moments that crush it are Marge's reaction when the freakish mutated snowball cat burns the curtains,
Oh good, the curtains are on fire.
and Otto's reaction when fucking Bart is driving the bus all crazy.
Hey, this is fun, isn't it? We're gonna die, aren't we?
I personally think that Treehouse of Horror 2 is horrendously underrated, much like Season 3 itself, because all three stories are great, but the Bart Zone is just next level, and honestly, I don't see why this one hasn't come up on more best of lists. Regardless, this is one my friends and I quote a lot. I also didn't get this when I was younger, but I caught it when I was maybe 10, 11, 12. The whole thing with Bart turning his dad into a jack-in-the-box, then bonding with him at the advice of Dr. Marvin Monroe, culminating in him saying, "I love you, Dad," was the nightmare part for Bart, which is pretty funny. My advice is not sleep on Treehouse of Horror 2, because as a whole, it can contend with the best of them.
Bart, this one's for you. Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal.
Coming in at number 5, we have Nightmare Cafeteria. This is a mostly original story. I know the name is a parody of the show Nightmare Cafe that I think was on at the time, but the story itself seems to be not based on any particular movie or show. Nightmare Cafeteria basically puts Bart and Lisa in a situation where, to alleviate the overcrowding in detention and lack of budget for the cafeteria, Principal Skinner and the teachers start cooking and eating children. This is probably one of the most morbid Treehouse of Horror segments they've ever done, and it is legitimately disturbing at times, especially if you're a kid like I was when I first saw it. And I absolutely loved it back then, and still love it now. Everything from Martin being traumatized in the cage, to the free-range children, to the mean-spirited fate of Wendell. I remember feeling so bad for Wendell as a kid over this. I love how shitty Marge is when the kids tell her that they're eating kids at the school, and her advice to fucking her son and daughter.
You march right back to that school, look them straight in the eye and say, "Don't eat me."
Okay.
But the real icing on the cake here is the final 2 or 3 minutes of the segment. Most Treehouse of Horror segments up to this point ended on more or less a happy-ish, optimistic ending, if not an unhappy ending played for laughs. But no, Bart and Lisa get dropped face first into a grinder, the screen goes red, and this last frame is edited out on Disney Plus, by the way, and it then ends with another parody of a chorus line, a callback to the end of The Shining, where the fog turns the family inside out and they do a dance number. I can't help but think both this and the fog scene traumatized me a bit as a kid, But it doesn't matter because I fucking love this segment, and it provides pretty solid rationale as to why Treehouse of Horror 5 is considered the best one. David Merkin, the showrunner at the time, said he went out to make this the most brutal Halloween episode he could, believing that a Simpsons Halloween episode should be both funny and scary, and I totally agree with him. He went balls to the fucking walls on this entire episode, but this segment is still the best full-on horror story they've done. But there are still 4 more segments that I think capture the spirit of Halloween or horror a little better.
In fact, you might even say we just ate Ooter, and he's in our stomachs right now. Wait, scratch that one.
Coming in at number 4, we have Terror at 5.5 Feet. This is another Twilight Zone parody, and I mentioned earlier that It's a Good Life is probably one of the most popular Twilight Zone episodes. This is another very popular Twilight Zone episode. It's based on Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and it's another one that coincidentally was remade in the Twilight Zone movie. The story opens up with Bart having a dream of his untimely death on the school bus, and right away I'm actually laughing as I write this because the fucking crusty trading cards gag kills me every fucking time. But then when he actually has to go to school, he notices there's a gremlin on the side of the bus. I'll go ahead and say it. This segment is a little more shot for shot of its source material than the Bart Zone, and this one's actually more like the 80s remake than the original 60s episode, even taking some of George Miller's angles shot for shot. Any story where the character sees something and nobody believes them has the potential for greatness, and this story is no exception. It's a great parody of a classic Twilight Zone episode, and it's also just a classic Simpsons Halloween segment. There are laughs across the board, such as Otto killing Hans Moleman. Also, Skinner is great in this, from his explanation that his mother hid his car keys for talking to a woman on the phone,
She was right to do it.
to him and Willie's banter when they're trying to pull Bart in as he tries to stop the gremlin.
Pull!
I'm doing all the pulling, you blouse-wearing poodle walker!
Every character that appears in this is used to the best of their ability, from Skinner to Milhouse to the first appearance of Ooter to Flanders, who gets beheaded at the end, and this scene actually scared the shit out of me as a kid.
I'll be home, Bart!
It was genuinely disturbing. Like, already on top of a pretty mean-spirited finish for Bart as he gets shipped off to an insane asylum because he was causing a disturbance. I love this one. I look forward to seeing it every Halloween, but obviously there are 3 more segments that I like just a little more.
I don't see anything.
Hey, who's driving the bus?
Ooh, uno momento, por favor.
In the number 3 spot is Citizen Kang, and full disclosure, I actually hate political satire. I find it is the lowest form of humor, and that the jokes date themselves really fast, almost instantly. Just ask Samantha Bee. You know, assuming anybody remembers who Samantha Bee is. Political satire ages poorly, but that statement is not entirely true for Citizen Kang. While it is set during a federal election, namely the one between Bob Dole and Bill Clinton in the 90s, it doesn't rely entirely on references to either one's political career too much. Basic premise, Homer's abducted by Kang and coders, who then abduct Bill Clinton and Bob Dole in order to steal their physical forms and take over the Earth by masquerading as the president and his opponent to get themselves into power. There's another story where nobody believes the main protagonist, this time being Homer. When he tries to warn them that the president and his opponent are actually aliens, he ends up getting thrown out of a debate. Homer finds a spaceship just parked in the middle of the forest in a humorous screw the audience shot, and attempts to retrieve Clinton and Dole, only to jettison them out into space where they die. And believe it or not, this is considered a somewhat realistic depiction of what would happen if you were shot into the vacuum of space. They just fucking die. That shit always makes me laugh. It's a classic gag. This is probably one of the reasons why it made it up so high. There's some more clever satire when the aliens are revealed and state that because it's a two-party system, that the people of America will have to vote for one of them. And this line about voting for a third-party candidate is the realest political thing The Simpsons have ever said.
Go ahead. Throw your vote away.
Of course, this all leads to Kang becoming president and enslaving humanity, which is pretty much how any election goes. Citizen Kang somehow, by the miracle that is the writing style of the show under Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, did not age itself as a political thing too much. And while it's not exactly horror-based, and its Halloween theme is only held together by the appearance of Kang and Kodos, it remains my third favorite Treehouse of Horror segment because it's just so fucking funny.
What are you spraying me with?
Run! So no one will believe your story.
Ah!
And don't come back.
Coming in the runner-up spot is A Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace. I personally think that Treehouse of Horror 6, out of all the Golden Age Treehouse of Horror episodes, is the weakest one. Does that mean it's bad? No, of course not. But you have a segment to start off that's just okay, and an ending segment that looks kinda cool, has some funny moments, but when you get down to it, it only serves to showcase the CGI graphics. But in between the mediocrity, you have what is one of the absolute best Simpsons Treehouse of Horror parodies ever made. A Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace is obviously a parody of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and while I haven't in great detail spoke of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, opting to shift my focus in videos more to Friday the 13th, I love the first 3 Nightmare on Elm Street movies and somewhat enjoy the rest, besides the remake, and New Nightmare, and Part 6, okay. In place of Freddy Krueger, we have Willie. I don't remember his last name. I know he has one, but I'm not that deep into the lore. Regardless, he's a great substitute for Freddy Krueger. He's not an implied child molester like Freddy Krueger, thank God. Basic premise, Willie haunts kids in their dreams, parents and authoritarian figures don't believe them, and it all comes to a head when Martin basically dies in class in a brutally hilarious fashion, and Marge is forced to tell the kids what happened. And hey, Willie died because of Homer's stupidity, and Willie vowed revenge on all the parents' kids.
A strike where you cannot protect them in their dreams.
In the climax, Bart goes after Willie in his dreams. Lisa's supposed to stay up and watch him, but fails. But then Maggie comes and saves the day. I'm honestly shocked I've never seen this one in more, like, top 10s, not as high up as it was in mine. Then I realized why I like this one so much, is I think this is what sparked my interest in 80s slasher movies, which led to me seeking them out in my preteen years and becoming a huge fan of the genre. Other than that, my personal connection, it's an effective parody that doesn't have to go beat for beat with its source. It takes the concept and makes it its own. Couple in the fact that it's pretty fucking funny, captures the trifecta necessary for a Treehouse of Horror segment, funny, Halloweeny, and horror-y. It's the perfect candidate for a runner-up spot. And honestly, like, this episode did creep me out a little bit as a kid. Like, Willie all burned up is pretty fucked up. And I recently discovered that you can actually see Willie in the opening pan whip. Somebody pointed that out and I saw a picture on Twitter and that just blew my mind. Because, like, I've been watching this episode since I was 6 years old for almost 25 years and I never noticed that before. But most importantly, this segment brings the laughs for about 75% of the runtime. Even the ending, where Willie is back somehow and forgets his gun on the seat, leading to him comedically chasing after the bus. It's as if he just didn't kill a bunch of kids before. I remember always hoping as a kid that they would do a follow-up to this in a future Treehouse of Horror episode, but it was never done. Actually, that's a pretty good idea. I don't know why they never did sequel segments in any of the Treehouse of Horror episodes. I guess it goes to show how uninspired the modern day writing staff really is. But either way, I probably would not have liked it better than the original. Anyway, before we get into number 1, let's talk about some honorable mentions. Before we get to my top pick, which at this point I think it's pretty obvious what it's going to be, I want to list off a few segments that I adore, but they didn't quite cut the top 10 for me. These episodes are all great, and these segments are all great, and they do, in some form, meet the criteria to be top 10 segments, but ultimately, when it came down to personal preference, they did not make the cut. It's noteworthy that I didn't include any from Treehouse of Horror 3 in my top 10, and I know that's probably going to disappoint some people, because 3 is often considered the best one besides 5 and is usually in direct contention against 4, but I've seen 3 so many times because it aired in syndication relatively often when I was growing up. It was on that Treehouse of Horror VHS tape. Season 4 was one of the first seasons I owned. I'll go into more detail on Treehouse of Horror 3 at a later date because I do have a special video in mind pertaining to it, but suffice to say, regardless of what made the top 10, I love and value the majority of all these Treehouse of Horror episodes. At any given time, these honorable mentions could creep into the bottom 3. But let's get to number 1. Yeah, you saw this coming. At number 1, we have The Shinning. I try to pride myself on not going for the obvious answers, but The Shinning is the all-time greatest Treehouse of Horror segment because it perfectly presents what the Simpsons Halloween Special, Treehouse of Horror, whatever the fuck you want to call it, has to offer. It's a parody of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of the Stephen King novel The Shining, and fun fact, Kubrick himself was a huge fan of The Simpsons and wanted them to parody one of his movies, and he absolutely loved this segment. It's basically just a condensed version of the movie. The Simpsons family go to an overlook-like hotel where Homer's the caretaker over the winter, follows the beats of The Shining pretty well. Burns takes away the beer and cuts the cable to ensure a hard winter's work. Homer goes crazy, and it does such a good job parodying the movie. I love when the blood comes out of the elevator.
That's odd. Usually the blood gets off at the second floor.
But the tension is still there in a small form when Homer starts trying to kill his family. There aren't just some great references to The Shining, but also to horror in general, such as when Moe and the ghouls break Homer out of the safe, and it's just several horror icons from the 30s and 80s. But the coup de grace of this is the recreation of the typewriter scene from The Shining. This sequence is fucking mesmerizing, from the way it's drawn and colored to the way the dialogue pans out to Homer's eventual insanity. As mentioned before, Treehouse of Horror 5 is most commonly considered to be the best Treehouse of Horror episode, and that's mainly because of The Shinning. That's not to undersell how good the other 2 stories are, Time and Punishment and the earlier mentioned Nightmare Cafeteria, but The Shinning, it really elevates the entire episode because it's just that damn good. As a kid, I would literally wait for this to come, like, around syndication, and I didn't even know the order of the episodes until the DVDs came out, so I just kind of had to wing it, and I would get pretty pissed off if I went to elementary school the next day, and somebody was like, oh, the one with The Shinning was on last night, and I was like, oh, I missed it. Like, I love Treehouse of Horror 5. Everybody loves Treehouse of Horror 5. Everybody who's a Simpsons fan loves Treehouse of Horror 5. And as a kid, this episode only really came on 2 to 3 times a year, not counting Halloween, and I never got sick of it. In contrast to 3, which I watched a lot, and am kinda on now, like, 5, perfect Treehouse of Horror episode. I could watch it pretty much any time. You put it on, I'll sit there and watch it. And a large factor, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, is The Shinning. It is the ultimate Treehouse of Horror segment. Hadn't been done before, hasn't been done since. Nobody can outdo this one. It is just perfect. The imagery is kind of morbid, but it is also the funniest Treehouse of Horror of all time, and that's why it is on my number 1 and my top 10 favorite Treehouse of Horror episodes.
Oh no! We left Grandpa back at the gas station. What about Grandpa?
The Simpsons Halloween specials are always going to be a staple to any Halloween festivities, and while the quality depleted, I still find myself inconsistently tuning in when the new one airs only to be horribly disappointed. But that's okay, because the first, let's say 10 or 11, are unforgettable and will be preserved for the ages. If you like this video, hit that subscribe button, drop me a like, share me with your friends, or feel free to just flame me in the comments. Generation Y Entertainment, signing off.
Here comes the Talking Express!
Okay, here's a little treat for those of you that stayed past the credits. Did you ever catch in Night of the Dolphins or whatever when Lenny is killed but shows up later in the crowd scenes when they're all fighting the dolphins? This just shows that all involved lost passion for the show and didn't give a flying fuck about consistency. Happy Halloween, everybody!